Thank you very much. It's a little bit like being in Asia when they do that, all the sort of flashing lights. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me. And what I want to talk about is, I've called it Everyone Knows, Exploring 21st Century Population Myths. And that is because there are certain things that everyone knows about. They know, for example, population growth is completely out of control. It's because women are having far too many children. And there is going to be a massive economic hit because of aging populations. The only thing is, it's actually no, no, and no. Our population is not out of control, and as I will show, in actual fact, there's some good news. Fertility is falling dramatically, and aging populations is not really about demography, it's actually about policy. And this is actually a wonderful day to do this on, because I'm sure you're all aware that on Monday we had World Population Day. This is a day always on July the 11th. The UN designated it several decades ago. And that's when we celebrate the world population. And this year, it coincided with the United Nations launching their 2022 report and a fantastic update on exactly where we are with global population. And so you're the first people to see these slides because we sort of whipped them in to the PowerPoint when we received them. So, world population prospects 2022. And I think probably the most interesting fact is that in November of this year, the world will hit 8 billion. I remember talking about this in 2011. That's when we hit 7 billion. And what is really interesting is if we look back, we can see the pace of change. So in about 1804, the world hit the first 1 billion people on the planet. And it took another 120 years to about 1927 before we hit 2 billion. And then it took till 1960 before we hit 3 billion. And from then onwards, every single decade, we've put on 1 billion. Until now, because what this shows is finally our world population growth is starting to slow. It's what we expected, but it's actually going to happen. We will not hit 9 billion, we think, probably till about 2050, somewhere between 2040 and 2060. And from then onwards, we hope our population is going to flatten and possibly even decline. There are some caveats, and I'll talk a little bit about this as we go on. So, this fear that we would have rapid overpopulation, which was completely out of control, has gone. I'm not going to talk about the environment today, but I think we've replaced the fear of population growth by overconsumption, and particularly overconsumption here in the Northern Hemisphere. And the reason that this has happened is because of falling fertility. So let's look at some of those graphs and what they are telling us. So this is a brand new slide, and what is really interesting is if you look at the yellow, this is from 1950 to 2050, and you can see its projection in the middle, you can see the growth rate has been slowing, but is really going to fall. But see, the number of persons will continue to increase, and that's because of something called demographic momentum. The way to think about it is that every baby girl that is born today is a potential mother. She may have no children, and in fact, increasingly women are becoming child-free by choice, but she may well have 2 children if she lives in Europe or North America, and she may have 9 children if she lives in Nigeria. There's nothing we can do to stop that mother having children, but what we can do is give her the possibility of choosing to have fewer children. The other thing, that's fertility, life expectancy. So life expectancy has continued to go up, so much so that for the very first time, world population growth is as much due to life expectancy as it is to fertility. So falling mortality among older ages means that we have far more generations living on the planet at the same time. And I'm going to demonstrate that slightly later. So life expectancy, at the top, we have women. Women always, at all ages, have lower mortality rates than men. We saw it in the COVID epidemic. It's very standard. Spanish women, Japanese women, and French women, at the moment, top. Then there's a drop to UK women and American women, and you can see the dotted line, which is men, are consistently below. Now, I can understand as an English woman why my life expectancy might be lower than a Japanese woman, but why is it lower than a French woman? And the answer is, it isn't La Manche or the Channel that divides us. The line actually goes across the middle of France. And what we see at the population level is now really being supported by our understanding of biological aging. And it's around diet and lifestyle. And we know that the Mediterranean diet and similar diets really is, at the population level, encouraging these long-lived populations. And those populations who eat wrongly, smoke too much, don't do enough exercise, that's when we see life expectancy not increasing. So much so that if we project this forward, what is going to happen to our children? And this was a fantastic study published in The Lancet, and it's the oldest age at which at least half of a birth cohort is still alive. And they took 2007, and if you look right at the top, we have Japan, and they are suggesting that half of the people who were born, baby boys and baby girls who were born in Japan in 2007 will live to 107. And we have in France and Denmark, and I think it's the US, 104, and I think the UK comes in at about 103. So there is no evidence at the moment that our life expectancy at the population level is actually going to decline. And right at the end, I'll talk a little bit about COVID and the impact we think that might have had. Let's go on to look at childbearing in more detail. One of the really fantastic things that that the UN have told us is the tremendous rate at which the total fertility rate or the childbearing rate has come down. So I have used slides like this a lot, and I've always said in 2/3 of the world's countries, women are at, near, or below replacement. In other words, they're having about 3 children. From Monday, that figure is 2.3 children. That's amazing. 2/3 of the world's countries are more or less at replacement and will be at replacement by the middle of this century. Absolutely extraordinary. And if you look at these, if you look at the yellow, they are countries which are below replacement now. They don't replace their populations. No surprises there, really. Maybe Brazil a little bit surprising. And then you have those countries which are just above replacement. And then you have the red, and the red is sub-Saharan Africa. And still in that part of the world, we do have these huge, large families, childbearings between 4 and 9 on average. And one of the things I will discuss is Africa really going to come down to 2.1 by 2050, 2060? That's what the UN says, but I think there's a lot of caveats about that, and we'll come back to that right at the end. Put those two together, and you've got something called demographic momentum, and this explains what I said at the beginning. So in panel A, these are the brand new figures. You have the global total fertility rate, and you can see 1950 to 2050 and how it dramatically has come down. Many people are surprised how quickly it has come down. But then you can see the number of births and why that is still high and how it's going to flatten from about 2030. And then we can put all of it together and we can look at, this is how we get to the predicted 8 billion. So on this side, panel A, we have population size, the number of persons, and you can see how there is quite a lot of variance, but basically they think we will flatten and probably keep, 10 billion will probably be peak population, and now 8 billion, this will probably be peak growth. So we've probably hit peak growth in the growth rate, but in fact we're going to go on to continue to 10 billion. And look at this one over here, the panel B one, is amazing. So the blue is births and the red is deaths, and you can see that globally we will be having more deaths than births. So this is the basic demographics that the UN have told us. Whoops. So the UN came up with some very simple messages. Let's have a quick look at what those were. The key messages are, as I said, world population continues to grow, but the pace of growth is slowing down. That's good. This is really important, this one. Policies aimed at reducing fertility would have little immediate impact on the pace of global growth. The reason why this is important is twofold. It comes back to what I said about sub-Saharan Africa, and we know how to reduce fertility, we know what kind of policies work, and they're all about supporting women, increasing education and health, and enabling women, empowering women to have the choices to have fewer children. We also know that here in many European countries, and I don't know whether you read, but there was an article in the Sunday Times from someone who wrote that we should be taxing child-free women or childless women, and it caused a little bit of a stir. And I did a Radio 4 program on Monday, which we had huge feedback from, saying this is completely ridiculous. Just think this through. Just think about trying to encourage people in the Northern Hemisphere to have more children, to cope with their aging population. So number one, all you're going to do is increase the dependency ratio completely. So the total dependency ratio will go up. You'll have more older dependents and more younger dependents for the next 20 years. Because every baby that's born today, it's going to take 20 years before they're a worker. And secondly, to go back to what I said very briefly about environment, we only have one planet, and we share this planet with many species. We don't want our population to go any higher than 9 or 10 billion. And in particular, I think the responsibility, as I said, is reducing consumption. So the last thing we want to do is boost those high-consuming countries because of a fear that we may well be aging or declining. This is a natural transition across the 21st century. It's going to happen, and the way to tackle it is to put in place policies to ameliorate that transition. And we can discuss that in a minute. But basically, policies aimed at reducing fertility take a long time to come through. While life expectancy continues to increase, globally large disparities remain. We still have a huge battle on our hands. We have life expectancy here, huge inequality within our own country. If you look at the figures just for England, let's just take England. A 65-year-old man in England living in our three most bottom deprived, or 30% of our deprived areas. At 65, he will probably make it to 80, but he will go into ill health at 70. All his 70s are going to be in ill health. And you take the same man, and you take him from the top 30%, our most affluent areas, I presume many of the people here in this audience, and the life expectancy of that 65-year-old man is going to be well into his late 80s or even 90. And he will not go into ill health, on average, till he reaches 80. So within our country, huge inequalities in both life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. And a man here who may live to 90, if that man had been born in Sierra Leone, he probably would only live to 35. So we still live in a very unequal world. And I think one of the big messages coming out of this is that we have time across the 21st century to be able to cope with these demographic changes. And let's try to make every child that is born having full health, full education, and a long life. More and more countries have begun to experience population aging and decline. Currently, declining populations are only really, they're mainly in European countries, mainly Eastern European countries, a lot of that's to do with migration, and in Japan. But by 2050, 61 countries are going to be declining. And they're a wide range. Brazil, Germany, Russia, India, and China are all projected to decline. So decline in population, as well as population aging, is something we're going to have to come to terms with. And finally, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected all three components of population change. And I think that's really interesting. The data is still quite mixed. But if you look at the components we've spoken about, fertility, mortality, and a little bit about migration, we know after a pandemic, normally young people start to have a lot more children. We saw it 100 years ago after the Spanish flu. And that's because often it's babies and children that die in pandemics. In this case, it was older adults. And younger people of childbearing age, they were much more hit by the equivalent of an economic recession. It was the economic shutdown that affected them. Having said that, there's some really good data now coming out of some of my European colleagues, particularly at the Vienna Institute of Demography, which shows that already, we know fertility dropped. It dropped to about 1.5 here, so it went from about 1.89 to 1.5 in England. Already we know that's coming back. And it's very likely that fertility will slowly increase again, but it won't go above replacement here in the UK. In terms of mortality, all sorts of frightening statistics. We've knocked 11 years off life expectancy. Well, if you look at the graphs from all pandemics, yes, life expectancy plummets, but then it comes back quite quickly. But the really interesting thing this time is twofold. Number one, long COVID. We really do not know the impact of long COVID. We may not bounce back so quickly. It may be more this kind of an angle. And secondly, what was the really big impact? Just think of the NHS. The really big impact was on our health services, the way that it affected the ability to do screening and prevention and public health. So there is an argument that we may take quite a while to get back to the life expectancy that we have had in the past. It will happen, but it may take several years rather than several months. And in terms of migration, we only have to look at what has happened in this country. Without any doubt at all, the current government policy on immigration and Brexit had an impact, and the pandemic came in and compounded that. So the pandemic has affected migration. So I want to just sort of start rounding this up by looking at some really quite exciting visuals. So everything I've been talking about, let's look at it visually and see if we can get an image of what's happening. This is the population pyramid from 1990. You all know what a population pyramid is. Lots and lots of young children being born and death across the life course, and those children coming into the workplace and really boosting our economies. And what you need to look at here is, look at the green. The green are the high-income countries of Europe. And you can see even by 1990, we had moved more or less from a pyramid, more or less into a skyscraper. And that meant that all the babies that were being born, on the whole, had long, healthy lives. Half our population reaches 80 now. Half the population is going to live to 80. Tremendous change that has happened. And that had happened by 1990. Then look at the blue, which is basically China, and the real powerhouse China still had in the world population. Look at the brown, which is South Asia, predominantly India. And then look at that narrow purple. So look at those colors and how they change, as I'm just going to whiz through 3 other slides, and look at the shape. So 2020, already China is declining, and Africa is coming through, and the shape is shifting, but not as much as by 2050. And what we see here is exactly what the UN has projected. Africa is going to be driving the world population. That's where all the population growth is going to be. Africa is going to go from 1 to 2 to 3 billion, maybe even as high as 5 billion, depending how quickly that childbearing comes down. China is moving out of the picture, and India is moving out of the picture. But the really interesting thing is the shape. And that's what I meant at the start when I said for the very first time, life expectancy is driving population growth just as much as fertility. Right at the top, think, there's all these people here, and I'm in that age group, so demographically, we're not dying on time in order to maintain a population pyramid. We're living into our 80s and 90s. And as a consequence, all those multiple generations are coming through. And here we see it exactly as the UN Monday projections were. So right we have at the top, let's look at Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is that purple, and you can see it really rising up there to join China and India. So Africa is the place to watch from a population growth bit. So let's just round this up, high, middle, and low-income countries, and say, well, what kind of demographics are occurring in each of these? And I've just put them on a map here. If you're an economist, you might think of emerging markets rather than middle and low income. But basically, the high income are the blue, and you can say basically the middle income are the green, and more or less the red are the low income. Fits in very well with that fertility pattern. And this is what we are seeing demographically. So if we start at our low-income countries, basically sub-Saharan Africa, you can see the bluer children, The red are people of working age, and the green are older adults. And you can see this shrinking of children, the growing of those of working age, and a growing older population, but slow. What's happening in middle-income countries is dramatic fall in children. They're the ones that are now going into below replacement. Extraordinary that they should be below replacement so early. A working bulge and growing older people. And then high-income countries, we're not surprised by this. Very few children, declining labour, and a growing older population. So just to set to the scene for the questions that are coming up, let's look at each of these and the kind of issues that they're going to face. So, what are the really big problems that are going to happen in Africa? Well, one of them is urbanization and urban sprawl. We know one way in which to reduce fertility, reduce childbearing, is through urbanization. We also know that that is the way to encourage the demographic dividend. And yet, the really big move in many parts of Africa are these small 500,000 shanty towns. No education, no health, no facilities. And this is not going to help many of those countries get out of poverty. The second really important thing is, I think, an important piece of work that we did at Oxford around whether the African population, sub-Saharan African population, this is a very broad generalization in this talk, we've got far more detail in our paper, is going to actually reduce its childbearing to 2. And we know that across the globe, as we educate women, we improve their health, so they choose to have fewer children, and across the globe, consistently, it's 2 children. Women want 2 children, typically boy and a girl in that order. Real generalization, but that's more or less what these demographic and health surveys are telling us. However, what we have done at Oxford is look at what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, and I have to say that ideal family size among educated women in many of these African countries, East, West, South, and Central, is not 2, it's 4. And the argument can be that we're empowering women to choose through contraception and education, and they're not choosing 2 like the rest of the world, they're choosing 4, 2 to stay at home and 2 to go off and bring back remittances. And if that is the case, we're not going to stop growing, and we may well have a maximum world population of 12 billion. I don't think we will, but I think we can't be as confident that actually Africa's population is going to slow as quickly as the UN thinks. We've still got to keep our eye on that part of the world. It really does need our resources. Moving into like emerging markets, or what we would call sort of middle-income countries, I think the really important thing here is what are we going to do with the youth bulge. So the youth bulge is huge. The youth bulge could be an amazing demographic dividend, and some parts of the world have really been able to capitalize on that. But other parts of the world, particularly, for example, I'm thinking in some parts of South Asia, have not really been able to capitalize, because you need governance, regulation, trust, education, and health. And if you're not careful, you just get youth violence and youth unrest. And I think, particularly if we look at the MENA regions, there is a real massive youth problem there. And this is compounded. We've talked a bit about the environment, but it's also compounded by the second factor, which is the growth of technology. You cannot look at demography singly. You have to look at the other big trends of the 21st century. And I just want to illustrate this with a very simple story. And that is, in my book, or one of my books that was showed up there, How Population Change Will Transform Our World, we had a case study, and it was a Midwest textiles factory. And at one point in the 1970s, 13,000 people worked in this huge factory making textiles. Then it all went down to China and India, and then the talk was, well, they're pricing themselves out, so we'll go to Bangladesh and Vietnam. Do you remember that story? I mean, people don't hear about it anymore, but that's what people used to say. Now, they've brought all their production back to this factory. 139 workers make exactly the same amount as they did with 13,000. It's called technology. It's robots. And there is a real fear that these middle-income countries are really going to lose out because technology is going to take the place. And then finally, what is happening in our high-income countries? This is all about an aging population and some of the issues that they're going to face. And I know in the panel that's what we're going to be basically focusing on. But the obvious thing to say is it's not just about social security and just about healthcare. It's actually about everything else. Many countries in Europe within 20 years will have half their population aged over 50. We've never had regions of the world where half our population is aged between 50 and 100. We have to transform the way we work to enable older adults to stay in the workplace if that's what they want. We have to transform transport and housing, lifelong education. The whole of those things that support us have got to change. But I know we're going to be picking that up later. So hopefully that has been a good overview of the demographics. As I say, this is the first time we've been able to present the new UN figures, and I very much look forward to maybe discussing some of these issues in the panel afterwards. Thank you.